This is the Wide Format Impressions broadcast. Welcome back to the broadcast. I'm Dan Marks. To start this episode, let's consider a riddle. What do you get when you cross transportation with a hotel, with an amusement park, with a health club, with a restaurant group, with a large boat? You guessed it, cruise ship. When you think about it, the cruise industry encompasses many of the market areas wide format producers widely serve, making parts of it familiar. But it's what makes it unfamiliar that makes it most interesting. To help us gain a deeper understanding, I'm pleased to welcome Rich Thompson, president of Ad Graphics, located in Pompano Beach, Florida, a true wide format industry veteran. Welcome, Rich.
Hey, Dan, how are you?
I'm great. First, for those who are not familiar, can you tell me a bit about Ad Graphics? When did the company start? What did it serve at the time? And how has it changed since then?
We started back in the early 90s when large format digital graphics were something that were, for a lot of people, just, what do they say, a shimmer in your mother's eye or something. The first machine we purchased could do a whopping 36-inch wide material. And that was large in those days. And the graphics had to come either as a photo that we scanned or on a floppy disk. Remember those floppy disks?
Oh, yeah. And who were your primary customers at that point?
At the time, our primary customer base were sign companies.
Okay.
Sign companies were great at doing red vinyl, green vinyl, blue vinyl, but it had never seen graphics pictures on vinyl or images on vinyl or gradients on vinyl. So that's who we first targeted when we started our marketing and sales.
Okay. And then today we're talking about serving the cruise ship industry. So what was your first cruise-oriented work you did, and when was that?
So being here in Florida is really our entree into the whole cruise boating industry. A small little known fact is that the Fort Lauderdale Boat Show draws over 100,000 people every year. And with economic impact of over $2 billion or close to $2 billion a year. So if you compare that to, say, the Super Bowl, which is a huge economic impact, it's roughly double of what the Super Bowl brings in. So the Fort Lauderdale Boat Show will bring in double the economic impact that the Super Bowl would bring in. And that's the Fort Lauderdale Boat Show. Then you got the Miami Boat Show and the Palm Beach Boat Show. So boats in Florida go hand in hand.
And then what was your entree into serving the cruise segment?
They, in the beginning, contacted us.
Okay.
It was being at the right place at the right time, geographically, being here in Florida, and where most of the cruise industry is based. And Florida is the epicenter for most cruising.
And were they looking for simple signage applications at that time?
We worked, some of our first entrees were with artists. They wanted to put something more than simple letters on the sides of the boats. So they wanted graphics. And there were artists who would go on the side of a boat and paint their murals. And that was cumbersome, took a long time. And there was an easier, more efficient way of doing it, which would be printing film, vinyl film, and adhering it on the sides of the transoms on the boats.
And when did you first do that? Because I know we've talked about this and you had conveyed to me that it was really rather challenging work. So when did you start doing that?
The 90s, in probably the mid-90s was some of our first ones.
Okay.
And a lot of the attention that I got is we did boats, not cruise boats, but we would do fishing boats or race boats or cigarette boats or people's personal yachts. And little by little, the word got out that, oh, you can put graphics on boats. How big can you go? How big of a boat can you do?
Yeah. How big a boat do you have?
That's right.
And in terms of scale, like how big were these prints on the hull then?
Huge. So a boat is big.
Yeah.
You don't realize how large a boat is until you stand up side by side next to it. They are huge. So it's just gargantuan. It's multiple billboards side by side, if you want to scale it that way. Multiple tour buses side by side, stacked on top of each other. It's a lot. There's a lot of space there.
Yeah, but I think you had said that one thing that was surprising is that from a distance, it looks like the surface of the ship is quite smooth, but in reality, it it is not at all.
It is not, sorry to say, especially when you're, get on the smokestacks and some of the other parts of a boat. You think it looks nice and smooth, but it's very rough. It tends to be very textured. They've gotten better over the years. In the past, they would just whitewash them. They would, oh, it's starting to look a little rusty or starting to look a little degraded. Let's just slap some paint on this. Let's just throw white on top of to stop the oxidation, to stop it from corroding anymore. Yeah, it would. Believe it or not, there are areas that if you start picking with your finger, you can flake it off.
Yikes. Yeah. And specifically going back to that early, I don't think there were films yet for rough surfaces. It was the Wild West back then. I'm sure it was a challenge to get those things to stick, and it probably taught you a lot of tools and techniques to make things work.
And there was a big learning curve, and we learned that smoother is better. And we also learned how to do textured surfaces. That was also getting with the tech services department of the different vinyl film manufacturers and saying, hey, do you have something for not just curved surfaces, but textured surfaces? It's one thing to stretch vinyl on a curved surface, but what about a heavily textured surface? So we're very grateful for some of the labs and the tech service departments of the different film manufacturers to help figure out how to make the film conformable, how to learn using rollers and heat to get these to conform to the surfaces. And remember, you're doing this for the most part outdoors. You can't bring a boat inside a garage, right? And another interesting fact is they're always on the water, and it's always windy on the water. You're fighting wind, you're fighting the elements. It gets hot here, the material gets droopy. There's a lot that goes on.
Now, one thing I wanted to ask about is my understanding is for a lot of cruise work, the time available to deliver and install the graphics is incredibly limited. It's essentially the amount of time the ship is in port between voyages, and that may be less than one day. So that makes it a particular logistical challenge. So how does your team prep for that type of flurry of activity?
Sometimes we have to do it in stages. We can't do it all at once. We have to go in and do part one night and part the next week when it comes back. Sometimes they'll keep it in port for a couple of days. And also, these ships are international, so you can't just drive up and walk on. You have to have clearance. You need passports. It's an international venture.
One of the things I wanted to ask about, there is that international part with the passports and all that, all the permitting. There's got to be pretty high level of, I think you would need to have fire certified materials you're using, all that kind of stuff that you need to deal with as well.
Correct.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. You know that from some of our previous talks and podcasts and some magazine articles, we wrap airplanes. Wrapping airplanes, putting graphics on airplanes is not just sticking a sticker on the side of a fuselage. You need to have all your ducks in a row, and there's FAA and certifications and things. Boats are the same way. As soon as a boat is not governed by laws of the land, that's a pun, by the way, laws of the land, because it's not on the land, it's governed by maritime law. Maritime law, there are different attorneys, different lawyers, different set of laws. You can't just, whatever you do on land, you can't do on a boat because it's governed by different bodies of law. We learned that when we wanted to put installers on, and you have liability insurance, you have workers' comp insurance. Guess what? You need to have special riders for maritime liability, maritime workers' compensation insurances. So that opens up a whole nother aspect of what you're going to do. And the graphics, that's just the labor part. Then you have the graphics part. You have to be, there's materials for boats that need to be what's called IMO certified.
Okay.
You may be familiar with California, I think it's flame rated Class A, right? Or flame retardant. So if you're doing wall coverings, if you're doing banners, if you're doing graphics, they need to pass these flame retardancies and the flame spread indexes. Same thing with boats, but you can't use the ones that you use for buildings on land that you can use for boats on the water. So they need to go through their own testing. They need to go through their own certifications, and they all need to be certified by the Coast Guard. So we have Coast Guard certifications that are required to be able to put graphics in boats that could catch on fire or things could happen to them.
And I think from a business standpoint, did you at one point set out and say, I'm going to learn all I need to know to be able to serve this space? Or was it more like School of Hard Knocks?
Yeah,
or you keep running into one wall and then the next?
You can't give me credit for being that smart. That's trial and error. We made mistakes. We made mistakes when we put stuff on airplanes that fell off and aircraft that got grounded because we didn't do the right thing. Same thing with boats. We got in there to do things, and all of a sudden, we didn't have the right insurances. So the installers couldn't do their work. We didn't have the right approvals. We didn't have our Coast Guard certification. We didn't have, just the list goes on of all the things. And you learn by your mistakes or by your shortcomings. Mistakes that you planned to err on, they were just shortcomings that you learned.
Does that playing field continue to change over time?
It is continuing to change. But I guess it settled down more. It was that, so we have Coast Guard certifications that need to happen. And when you're doing some of the boats, some of the biggest boat yards are in Europe and the northern coast of Germany outside of Hamburg. There's a couple of huge boat yards where they're being manufactured. We have a project going on next month off the coast of Spain because there's a boat in dry dock there. So we have to send a crew over there. We'll send a crew over there and put graphics on a boat.
Now, there's the outside of the boat. And then when you get to the inside, I was on a cruise, I guess a year and a half ago. And as somebody who's always looking at wide format graphic applications, I'm seeing wall coverings, retail displays, stuff for decor, stuff for theater sets, all kinds of stuff. Have you found that there is more opportunity or more choices in the candy store now for you? Or are you locked into an area where you're like, we do this and we're not really looking at the stuff outside of it?
That's a good question. We're locked into a niche that we fit very well. Some of the other stuff that you mentioned, the display work and stuff, most of that is purchased offshore. So it comes from other countries, third world countries, islands, different places, because the cost of that is a lot less. Our niche is more where you have the required certifications and the higher restrictions.
Okay.
That fits us better.
Now, I did have a question. I know we spoke once, and you said that during the pandemic, when cruise ships largely were not running at the time, Ad Graphics went out and did some refresh work on some ships. Can you retell that story a little bit? And what was that like?
Sure. In fact, we were, ironically enough, when COVID hit, and I don't like to remember that, if you remember the news, there were thousands and thousands of workers stuck on the ships. They couldn't get on shore because of COVID. We were a lighthouse in the Bahamas, and we would fly over to the Bahamas from Florida. And when you flew over there, there's a spot in the water that the Gulf Stream does not travel. So the water is dead, so to speak. So the boats could park there and not have to waste so much gas or fuel because there was no Gulf Stream to pull them. And there were thousands of people just living on the ships trying to get off. And you would see dozens of them out there just sitting there. And at the time, they wouldn't let us go to the ship, because during COVID, they didn't know how the contamination was going to come back and forth between the workers. And then when they would bring one to port, they would isolate the workers on a part of it, and then we would be able to work on another part of it. It was a little cumbersome, a little hairy, but during COVID, man, we were trying to get any bit of work we could. Everybody was trying to get any kind of work anybody could get.
Right.
So
and you would go out by helicopter out to the ships?
No, they would bring them into a dock. But the people were quarantined on the ship, and they would cordon off certain spots of the ship, isolate it. They would fog it down with foggers and misters, give it a time for it to clean up, and then we would go in.
Interesting. It definitely is an example of you're probably on that one of those ships thinking, how did I get here in my career?
Please, Lord.
Yeah.
Stuck on the ship.
Yeah. And how can I get off?
And then every time you got on and off the boat, they took one of those, remember those swabs that had to go up your nose and scrub your brain? Oh, yes. We'd have to do that at least once to twice a day when we were getting on the boat and when we were getting off the boat. At first, it was annoying, agonizing, and then you didn't think twice about it. It got to be commonplace. Had many a nostril scrubbed.
Nice. Okay. And so looking at the cruise companies themselves, one of the things I was interested in is, let's say you're working for ABC Cruise Company, doing work for them. Would XYZ Cruises be less likely to contact you because you're working with their competition, or more likely to contact you because you have experience in that space?
Yeah, it's mostly more likely because we have experience. People want the path of least resistance. So if you have experience, if you can show that you've done it, you know the drill, they're more likely to trust your expertise and come to you versus someone green that hasn't done it before.
Seems like with all those certifications and all that institutional knowledge you've developed over the years, it's got to be a bit of a selling point.
Yep.
In terms of, I know we talked about a little bit of School of Hard Knocks, but we talked about how you trained up to serve the segment, but how do you stay on top of things and how do you monitor, let's say, trends or know what to expect in the next season or the year after that?
Sure. There are events and trade shows and stuff for that industry you can attend that'll help. Just like construction of houses is modified, the building standards modified, the same thing of the building of boats. But how boats were constructed 30 years ago are not how they're constructed and built today. Okay. You just have to be a part of that. And there's a lot of boats coming online the cruise industry has really exploded after COVID. If you watch the news, it's very popular for people to go on cruises.
Yeah, absolutely. One sort of final question I have is if the tangibles of serving the cruise industry are things like printing and installation capabilities you bring, and let's say some of that knowledge as well, what are some of the intangibles you think AdGraphics brings to those customers?
Yeah, some of the intangibles are location, as they say. We're right here in the heart of the cruise industry. That helps. So it's easy to meet with people when they have questions or want to see samples. It's very convenient. Then there's just the experience that we talked about, the School of Hard Knocks and continuing to learn. Always be curious. I'm that type of person. I'm always curious. I'm always trying to learn. I'm always trying to better myself. I read books. I like to watch series and documentaries on boats and shipbuilding and cruise industry.
Right. Now, do you go on cruises yourself just to get a sense of how things are going in that space?
Actually, not that much, to be honest with you. I probably should. That would be a great business expense, right? For investigative work let's go on a cruise. Let's go on a lot of cruises and see what it's like on the other side.
Yeah, weeks. Why not?
Sure.
I'll meet you there. You've been listening to the Wide Format Impressions broadcast. You can find more great content at wideformatimpressions.com.